Please take your Bibles and turn to Ruth 1. We're going to begin reading in verse 19 here in just a couple of minutes. We're coming up on our Spring-tastic weekend, an opportunity for us as a church to reach out into our community, minister with and to some of our families here at Pleasant Garden and to some of those in our community and in our neighborhoods. If you've not had a chance to check that out, you can go to our website and find out more details about how you can help. There's also a sign-up sheet in the back lobby for ways to join in alongside of our student ministry and our children's ministry and some others that are going to be helping make that day possible coming up on the 2nd of April. And we're looking forward to that opportunity to reach out into our community coming up here in just a few days. We're going to turn our attention in just a minute to Ruth chapter 1 and read just a few verses from here. I want to remind us of where we are in the story. Naomi has lost her husband and 2 sons. Ruth, her daughter-in-law, has also lost her husband. And where we're going to read in the text here in just a couple minutes is Naomi and Ruth's journey back to Bethlehem for Naomi, a return home, if you will. Now, the reality of Naomi's point in life right now particularly, and she's going to be the focus of what we're considering this morning, the reality of where Naomi was in a spot where she was experiencing a lot of pain, heart pain, life pain, and that's what I want us to unpack for a few minutes this morning. I want us to talk about pain and what the gospel, what the message of Jesus, what the scriptures have to say to us when we find ourselves dealing with pain. Now, pain comes in all shapes and sizes. A mom rushed back to the back bedroom when she heard her young 7-year-old son scream. And as she arrived in the bedroom, she saw his little 2-year-old sister with 2 handfuls of his hair where she was pulling it. And she gently untwisted her daughter's hands from her brother's hair, and she looked at her son and she said, there, she doesn't know that it hurts. And he just kind of nodded, and then she walked out of the room only to hear her daughter scream a few seconds later, and she ran back into the room and she said, what happened? And her son said, she knows now. Pain comes in all shapes and sizes. I was talking to a church member the other day, following up with the doctor. He was sharing with me one of the next steps for him is to begin a pain management regimen. I know with even my body in the early 40s, when I'm outside doing some things I'm not normally used to doing in the yard like I did yesterday, my body told me I was doing some of those things this morning when I woke up. Some surprises. Pain comes in all shapes and sizes. Sometimes it stays in the physical, but oftentimes it drifts down into the emotional, doesn't it? Heart pain, soul pain, relationship pain, and that's what Naomi was experiencing. The president of our United States from a bygone day, Thomas Jefferson, wrote in a letter to a friend, he said, the art of life is avoiding pain. Wouldn't that sum up for many of us our approach to a given day, a given week, a given stretch, a given situation, a given circumstance? And yet, life oftentimes puts us in a situation where avoiding pain is impossible, but how do we mitigate it? How do we address it? What do we do about it? And that's what we're going to have a chance to see as we glance into the text. Notice what the Bible begins to tell us in verse 19 of Ruth chapter 1. So the two of them, this is Ruth and Naomi, went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" And she said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. For Naomi, in Moab, without a husband, without her sons, with one daughter-in-law who chose to go back home and another daughter-in-law who chose to travel with her, she found herself at a place where she had run out of options. She wasn't sure what to do next. Everything in Moab looked uncertain, so gravely uncertain for Naomi in Moab that she chose to journey back to the land she grew up in, to the place where she was born, to the people that she had lived beside in the past when she was in Bethlehem. She chose to go back. And what we see in these 3 or 4 verses that we've read is a looking into the heart of a woman who's experiencing and living in the midst of uncertainty and pain and confusion and doubt. And yet against the backdrop of this, what we're going to see in the text and what we're going to be reminded of as we continue our way through this study of Ruth is that God looks upon us when we find ourselves in those spots. God sees our brokenness and our hurt and our pain and our loss. God sees our questions and our fears and our uncertainties and our unsettledness. And He has the gospel prepared to be delivered to us in the right time, in the right way, in the right method. And we're going to watch that in this text. I want to consider just a couple of lessons. Naomi teaches us about the gospel that pursued her. I remind you what I've shared with you a few times in this series. Ultimately, the book of Ruth is a book about God pursuing Naomi in her hurt and brokenness. And we see that take shape in the text today. 3 lessons that she teaches us about how God deals with us in our brokenness and our hurt. 3 lessons she teaches us about God's gospel for us in times of need. I want you to notice first, Naomi teaches us, she reminds us that circumstances can turn sweetness to bitterness. Circumstances can turn sweetness to bitterness. Interestingly enough, if you look at what happened in the passage, Naomi and Ruth go back to Bethlehem and they begin to converse with the women in Bethlehem who recognize Naomi. She's come back. We knew her. We grew up with her. She's familiar. What happened? What was Moab like? What was your experience? They begin to check on her immediately. Now, Naomi's name, the name in the original language, her name meant sweet. Her immediate reaction when she was being welcomed, when she was being met by the women of Bethlehem, the women she grew up with, the women she knew, her immediate reaction was, "Stop calling me sweet. Call me bitter. Don't reference me. Don't reference me as someone who's sweet anymore. Call me bitter." And then she begins to tell why she feels this level of hurt and this level of brokenness and this level of difficulty. And we're going to get there in just a second. But I want to hang out here for a minute. Because what happens in Naomi's life is what sometimes happens in our lives. And it's what we've seen happen in the lives of others. Circumstances can take sweetness and turn it bitter. Difficulties can cause heart pain and soul pain and body pain. Challenges and frustrations and losses and limitations can put us in a place where we start to meditate. We start to nourish ourselves, even medicate ourselves with the challenge and the difficulty we're living in. And it can take what was once a pleasant disposition, what was once a kindness, what was once a warmth, what was something that was once a compliment, what was something that as a name would have been a beautiful name to have. I mean, how many of you would love for your parents have named you something that meant sweet? I mean, isn't that just the sweetest thing for your mama to call you? And Naomi, that's who she was, and I'm sure there was a moment, there were seasons in her life when she embraced the joy of that, but no more. Because she had meditated, she had dwelled upon, she had allowed the circumstances in her life to cause her to turn bitter. And they were pretty rough circumstances. She was in a foreign country and lost her husband and lost her 2 sons. That's a lot. That's a lot to let go of. That's a lot to say goodbye to. She felt isolated. She felt helpless. She felt unsettled, uncertain, confused. And she allowed the circumstances and the difficult circumstances she was in to turn her toward bitterness. Now, I realize there's some in this room who've been through circumstances a lot like Naomi. You've lost somebody dear to you. There are others in this room, the loss might not have been in the form of death, but you've lost a spouse to divorce or to addiction. Or you've had a relationship with a child or a brother or a family member grow sour because of terrible decisions they've made, and the consequences of that is spilled out into your home and family in a destructive way. And the reality is, whether or not we like it, circumstances are going to come into our lives that are going to tempt us to allow those circumstances to turn us in a bitter direction, to sour our sweetness. And that's where Naomi found herself. Now, before we move off of this, I want to speak to us as God's people for just a second. Christians in the room, those of us that have been changed by the grace of Jesus. Realities like Naomi's journey and parallels to people we know. When we watch this unfold in the text and we see this unfold in the lives of people around us, it ought to invite us to be gracious. It ought to invite us to be patient. It ought to invite us to be long-suffering. But the reality for us oftentimes is that, have you ever noticed that we tend to mirror the attitude and actions we get from others? Have you ever noticed that? I mean, if you're driving, minding your own business, cruising along right around the speed limit, or maybe just, a couple of miles ahead of the speed limit, not too bad, but you're driving, and somebody whips around you and cuts you off, what's the first natural reaction you're probably going to have? Yeah, you want to hit the gas and you want to go cut them off back. We tend to mirror, we tend to be tempted to mirror the reactions and the attitudes we receive from others. And sometimes we're going to happen upon, and it might be somebody we're close to, or it might be somebody we come in contact with that we don't really know. But we're going to be tempted. We're going to see bitterness. We're going to see hurt. We're going to see resentment. We're going to see tension. And it might be tempting in our first reaction when we see that to give it back. You got a wall up, I got a wall up. You're glaring at me, I'm going to glare back at you. You're short with me, I'm going to be short with you. Listen, Naomi needed grace. She needed a lot of grace. God had grace for her. He's in the process of delivering it to her. And I just ask us as God's people, may God help us. May God help us to join in His work in delivering grace to people who need grace. May God help us to come alongside of His kingdom care for people who are in tough spots and broken situations. And may He give us the wise patience, the careful prayerfulness to not react initially, but to demonstrate kindness and compassion. And I I get a front row seat to watching what it looks like when a church does that really well. As a matter of fact, next Sunday is part of our worship time. The message portion of the service is going to be a video interview. I sat down with 3 ladies here at our church, Glenda McGinnis, Susan Marshall, and Christy Airwood, who've lost their spouses. We just talked through what that journey has been like for them and what God's shown them. And do you know one of the things you're going to hear next week in that video? You're going to hear about the faithfulness of God through God's people. You're going to hear about compassion and care and encouragement. And folks, God longs for us to be people that recognize when brokenness is over here around us, our first reaction should be to extend the compassion and grace of God through the hands and feet of His church. I want you to see what else Naomi teaches us in this text. She doesn't just remind us that circumstances can turn sweetness into bitterness, but Naomi also reminds us something that happens when we find ourselves in that spot. It reminds us of something that can happen between us and God. See, Naomi reminds us that when we find ourselves in one of those rough spots, it can be difficult to accurately discern God's hand. I want you to look at how she does this. Verses 20 and 21. I want you to listen. Her response to the women of Bethlehem, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara. For one, the Lord has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and 2, the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when 3, the Lord has testified against me, and 4, the Almighty has brought calamity on me?" She minced no words for how she felt and who she held responsible for her circumstances. Without hesitation, without pause, without a guarding of her tone and her words and her tongue, when the women in Bethlehem said to Naomi, "Hey, you're back," she said, "Don't you call me by my name, call me bitter, because God has been against me. God has been working against me. God has brought these circumstances into my life." Folks, I want to say this, because you might not be in a rough spot right now, but you could be. And if you are, there's a temptation that happens upon us when we find ourselves in rough spots. It's a temptation that's going to hit you and me at some point in time. The temptation is going to be for us to measure God in the middle. You're going to be in that spot, and it's going to feel like you can't breathe. It's going to feel unbearable. It's going to feel overwhelming. It's going to feel frustrating. And some of us don't have the guts that Naomi had to just come out and say in a Godward direction exactly how we feel. We soften it. We're there. We're in that spot. We're knotted up inside, and we're praying, but our prayers sound more like, "Why, God? God, I don't understand. God, this doesn't make sense. God, how long?" Naomi just cut past all that and went, "Hey, the reason I'm in this spot is because God's gone out against me." I'm not saying she was right, as much as I'm saying she was honest. And the mistake she made is the same mistake we often make. We measure God's faithfulness and integrity and compassion towards us in the middle of the rough spot. We measure God's character and compassion when it's hottest and hardest. When the circumstances have caused our eyes to see only the circumstances. May God guard us against measuring His care and His compassion and His faithfulness and His goodness and His generosity when we find ourselves in circumstances we don't understand. The reality is Naomi was in a spot where she was dealing with the consequences of her husband's decision to go to Moab. She was dealing with the consequences of difficulty. Was she dealing with God judging her harshly? Maybe. Maybe not. She landed there. She leaped there. She drew that conclusion. But there's another angle of this I think it's important for us to wrestle with for a moment or two. If it's true that the art of life, as Thomas Jefferson said, is to avoid pain, maybe sometimes rough spots and difficult places and challenges and storms, maybe sometimes we get in the rough spot and our desire to get out of the rough spot causes us to miss what God wants to do while we're in the rough spot. C.S. Lewis said it this way in his short book, The Problem of Pain. He said, pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks to us in our consciences, but he shouts to us in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. What is Lewis saying? Lewis is saying that when you're in the rough spot, when you're in that place that doesn't make sense, when you're in the spot where the pressure seems to continue to mount, instead of looking at God and starting to judge his character, God, where are you? God, why haven't you fixed this? God, how long is this going to last? Instead of our natural human reaction to get away from the pain, to escape the difficulty, to get away from the challenge or the frustration, instead of our natural reaction, perhaps God's inviting us to ask this question: Lord, what are you saying to me about you right now? Jesus, what do you want me to understand about you in the middle of this spot? Jesus, I don't understand. Jesus, I don't like it. Jesus, it doesn't make sense, but what would you want to teach me in this place? Otherwise, we can fall prey to exactly what happened to Naomi. We meditate on our bitterness. We throw our darts and stones, and sometimes they go Godward, and sometimes they go outward, don't they? Sometimes the people around us that care the most about us, that we're the closest to, when we're in that ugly spot, when we're in that tough place, they get our flailings. And they get our loose words, and they get our anger, and they get our resentment. And what Naomi is inviting us to see, what the text is showing us about her journey back home to Bethlehem, what God longs for us to hear in Naomi's hurt and bitterness is don't measure God in the middle. Because here's the beauty of it, folks. If we stopped right now and just went around the sanctuary from this side to this side, and then up in the balcony, do you know we would be here for days listening to the testimonies of the times when God came through in your rough spot? Some of you would have stories to tell that would last minutes, and others of you would have stories to tell that would last hours when you look back and you watch the faithfulness of God. Now, you didn't feel that way about the situation, the circumstance, the trial, the difficulty when you were in it, but now on the other side, you see clearly. You see His mercy, you see His providence, you see His protection, you see His forgiveness, you see His grace, you see His long-suffering, you see His compassion, you see His love. And if we went around the room telling others, telling ourselves what God's done, it would take us hours or days to get through the whole room. We must guard against measuring God's character and faithfulness in the middle. Why? Because there's something coming. Look at what we see in the text. Naomi reminds us that God can be found if we keep returning to Him. I want to read the last verse, verse 22. Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Now, the word returned in the text, this describes both Ruth and Naomi, is the same word that's translated in the Old Testament for repent. The picture that the text is showing us about Ruth, about Naomi particularly. Ruth had never been to Bethlehem before. but Naomi had. The picture that's being painted for us in verse 22 is one of turning our eyes back toward God. Naomi doesn't know what else to do, so she turns around and she goes back. The journey away from Bethlehem was ultimately a journey away from God, and it was a journey away from friends, and it was a journey away from God's protection and God's mercy in some respects. And Naomi and her family had gone away from God for a long time, but not now. What Naomi is doing now is she's returning. She's repenting. She's going back in the direction of the one who longs to meet her and help her and love her and pursue her and care for her. And then the text says something powerful. We glanced at it last week. I'm going to glance at it again. And it was the beginning of the barley harvest. What was happening in Naomi's story, what was happening with her and Ruth, they couldn't see it yet because they were still in the middle. They were just in the process of coming back to Bethlehem. They didn't have any clearer prospects of provision or care at this point in the story than they had when they left Moab. But that's from their perspective. They were looking at it this way, through a tiny lens, just a small tunnel, only looking at what was right in front of them. But God knew what was about to happen because God was orchestrating it. God was preparing them for a harvest. Now, some of y'all are going to say, boy, you starting to sound like a Pentecostal preacher up there. I want to be real careful not to do that. I want to be real careful not to put up in front of us a false sense of our ability to define the way God comes alongside of us. The truth is, some of us may be in a rough spot a whole lot longer than we want to, and some of us may find ourselves going through a rough spot that never gets fixed the way we would like for it to get fixed. But that in and of itself does not affect the character, compassion, and mercy of God. And in this story, what we're being told is that while Ruth and Naomi found themselves in a tough spot, God was preparing his answer of grace and compassion for them and was about to grant it to them in his compassion and in his perfect time. The issue that comes back to us, the question that comes back to us, the burden that comes back to us is trajectory. Which way am I pointing? When the difficulty happens, when the tough spot happens, when the pain feels so heavy, what am I going to do? What direction am I going to go? Am I going to point myself away from God? Am I going to go deeper into Moab? Am I going to go further away from him? Or am I going to have the courage and the spiritual strength to hear the mercy of God pleading for me to repent, for me to return, for me to come back in his direction? Because what Naomi does is she shows us that if we keep going to God, God's coming to us. It's a principle that's repeated all throughout the scriptures, Old Testament and New. Draw near to God and he will draw near to you. If we point ourselves in his direction, guess what? He's waiting there with open arms to meet us, to walk with us, to encourage us, to love us, to hold us, to care for us, to wrap us up in his grace. That can have gotten real interesting. I'm glad that wasn't trickier than it was. I was reading a couple weeks ago a commentary studying this series, and one of the authors made an interesting parallel, something I'd never seen before. He compared Naomi to Job. Think about the Job story. Job, Satan comes to God and he says, God, you have blessed Job, and actually God was the one to initiate the conversation. Satan, have you considered my servant Job? And Satan says, yes, of course I have, but you protected him. And God gives Satan permission to mess with Job pretty severely. Take his wealth, take his family, take his health. And yet, at the end of Job chapter 2, Job doesn't sin. The Bible says in all of his words and all of his response to all the loss, he doesn't sin. But what we do see happen with Job, as his friends come on the scene and they begin to try to explain Job's difficulty and make sense of it and lay blame at Job and say Job must have done something wrong somewhere along the way, Job begins this dialogue back and forth with God. And Job's asking all the questions we would ask. Why? I don't get it, Lord. Where were you? Why didn't you show up? Why didn't you fix this? Why didn't you stop this? And then in the process of God responding to Job, God basically says to Job, listen, you don't get to question me. You don't get to judge me. You're not. You don't see. You're not in charge of this whole thing that I put into place and I created. And by the end of the book, you see a restoration of Job, a reconciliation of Job with God, and a restoration that God gives him generously. And we read the Job account and we go, man, Job was a wonderful guy. Look at what he did. Look at what he persevered through. Look at how God preserved him. And then sometimes we read the Ruth story and we get to Naomi and we go, man, what a bitter old woman. I honestly, one of the things I appreciated so much about that parallel is Naomi gets a bad rap, doesn't she? Listen, she didn't ask to lose her husband or her sons. She didn't ask to be in a foreign country without any alternatives other than to go back. She was in a tough spot. She was in a rough spot, in many ways not of her own making. And what the whole book of Ruth is about is God pursuing her in a rough spot. And you see the beauty that God gives her multiplied over, so much so that by the time they get to the end of the book, one of the most powerful verses in the whole book is that daughter-in-law, Ruth, is better than 7 sons to you. The same women in Bethlehem praised Ruth for her compassion and provision and care for Naomi and how God unfolded the story. Listen, when you're in that place, keep pointing yourself toward God. A friend was lamenting to another friend about all that he had lost. He said to his friend, he said, I've lost my job. And his friend said to him, as soon as he said, it could have been worse. He said, I've lost my money. He said, it could have been worse. He said, I've lost my fiance. He said, it could have been worse. And he finally screamed at his friend and he said, how in the world could it have been worse? And his friend said, it could have happened to me. Doesn't matter what's happened. Doesn't matter what you've been through, what you're going through right now. There is a God who sees. And He's a God who just longs for you to point yourself in His direction and return. And come to Him for His comfort and for His strength and for His mercy. For His grace. Would you bow your heads and close your eyes as we prepare for invitation? I suspect there's a few of us in this room as believers that our reaction to some of the broken and hurting and embittered people around us has been less than grace. Maybe a few of us just need to take a few moments, perhaps at the altar, perhaps right where we're seated, and ask God to give us grace for those who are hurting around us. My guess is there's a couple of us in this room that if we're heart honest, we've turned away from Jesus. We're not looking in the direction of the one who cares about us more than we can ever imagine or comprehend. The trajectory of our life and our decisions and our pulls and our emotions and our circumstances, we're moving away from Him. And I just challenge you today, if that's you, don't walk out of this room without making that right with Christ. Don't walk out of this room without repenting, without turning again in His direction. He's longing for you right where you're at, down here at this altar, speaking with a pastor. He's longing for you to point yourself again towards him.